Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us this week to update us on the top events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. With that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. It's the middle of the summer, as it is pretty much all over, well, the northern hemisphere, let's say. And one would think, especially with the heat wave that Israel's been experiencing the last few weeks, issues would sort of be on the back burner. People are out vacationing or, going on holiday abroad in Israel. Even the Netanyahus have allowed themselves to go on holiday. I believe they're going next week. But obviously, even that is not without controversy. They're going to a little town, sort of holiday resort in the north. And there's already been a lot of controversy with the fact that there's going to be demonstrations outside. There's been drones above, and there's people who are basically reminding Netanyahu that they demand, him to act against the judicial reform and all sorts of things. And people who believe that he's as the statements say, a liar, a cheat, a dictator, all sorts of things. And even from within the village itself, there's a lot of controversy because one can imagine the security headache of having the prime minister visit. So there's security barriers everywhere, and farmers can't get to their fields, etc., etc. So even for Netanyahu, a holiday, a vacation is not without controversy. But if he does go on holiday and it's already been put back a day or so, he certainly, needs one because, again, even in the depths of the summer, Netanyahu is still dealing with some major issues. The Knesset is off for the next couple of months. The government is still working, obviously, the ministers are still working, but a lot of them are also on vacation, holiday. But what I've seen in the last week or so, I don't think I've seen in a long while. And what I mean by that is he's really having to deal with issues far beyond his regular schedule. I'm a member of the government press office media list, which basically, whenever there's a statement by a minister or prime minister or president, it goes up there and it's translated to English and it's sent out. And usually it's in reaction to an event or some speech that is given or some signing of something or an agreement or whatever it is. But there's something big coming when it just says statement from the prime minister without saying, at the event today of Prime Minister Netanyahu said. When it just comes as a statement from the Prime Minister, it's something he wants to get off his chest, it's something he wants to get out, it's something he feels he needs to deal with, and usually get one every so often. I think there's been about 4 or 5, if not more, over the last week, because he's really had to deal with, let's categorize them into 3 major issues. The first one is the economy. The second one is to do with security issues, the idea of readiness. And the third one is, let's say, religious coercion, stroke the conscription bill. And basically, on all 3 issues, really, depending on where you sit ideologically, politically, you'll see these things in drastically different ways. And I'll go through each one and explain what the differences of opinions are. Let's start with the economy. Ever since this government started down the road of judicial reform, there's been warnings that the economy will be drastically hit should some of the reforms go through, especially in the high-tech industry. One can imagine the high-tech industry massively centered around Tel Aviv. Again, it's a bit of a generalization, but there is some truth to it that many people at the higher levels of the high-tech industry are from the left, are people who didn't necessarily vote for this government, are from the wider Tel Aviv area. There's been even protests specifically by high-tech people. I think there was even a strike at one point. If my memory serves me, at one point, there was a day where high-tech people didn't go in or for a few hours. But as it's a private profession, obviously they can't strike too much. But basically, there's been warning of a brain drain or money going elsewhere, people not wanting to invest in Israel with all the uncertainty, with all the demonstrations. The accusations back and forth are that it's the reforms that is bringing the economy down, and others say, no, it's actually the reaction to the reforms. It's the demonstrations which bring this uncertainty. And a lot of people on both sides of the debate have been using international commentators, international economic ratings institutions like Fitch and Moody's, etc. Whenever they've mentioned anything about the uncertainty around the judicial reform, one side has used that to say, well, look, the international economic experts are saying that you can't be touching this because it will hurt the economy. Well, this week, one of the international credit ratings organizations left Israel with an A+ grading. And Netanyahu put out at least 2 press releases lauding that, saying, look, this is the real truth. Israel is not harmed by what is going on, and the international credit rating industry, which are very sensitive to changes and uncertainty, are basically giving Israel top marks. Obviously, the wider picture of it did mention the judicial reform. It did mention the fact that it could impact on Israel's economy and investments in the future. But this particular one did, give Israel a very high grade. If you speak to people in that high-tech bubble, if you speak to people in Tel Aviv, they'll all tell you, I had many conversations over the summer with people from there, and they all said that they know people are leaving the country, they know people who are taking their investments elsewhere. According to an article that came out today, 80% of high-tech companies, newly registered high-tech companies in Israel, are being registered in the US and not in Israel. Now, some say that that's because the US, especially I think it's the state of Delaware or something like that, are giving much better conditions, and it's not really to do with the Israeli economy. It's just some states in the US are willing to give better conditions for new startups. So again, depending on where you sit on it, you see the situation is incredibly dire if you're against the judicial reform, if you're against this government. And this government is trying to show, no, the situation isn't as bad as they make out. In fact, some of the international commentators say Israel's doing very well. And if there is a dip, and clearly there is at least a certain amount of a dip, inflation, the price of living, cost of living keeps on going up. They keep on raising the interest rate, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these are obviously connected to global events, but they would say that if there is a dip, it's a short term, but the long-term, longevity of the Israeli economy is good, et cetera, et cetera. So again, depending on where you sit, depending how you look at that, the IDF has really come into the debate in a way, probably, at least in recent years, in an unprecedented way on an issue unrelated really to the IDF insecurity, and that is the judicial reform and the fact that many reservists have basically, at first they just threatened, and now it seems that they've followed through on it and are not turning up for their annual service. Israelis up to a certain age have to do their annual service for a few weeks, up to a month, depending on what units you are. And at first, there were all these signatures and all these petitions that were basically saying that we're not going to come and serve. So they weren't really taken that seriously. A lot of them were elderly and retirees, et cetera, et cetera. But it is clear in recent weeks this has changed, and there have been substantial lack of people coming forward. Again, it's not the majority, it's not even a plurality, but it does hurt certain units, especially to do with Israel's readiness to deal with threats near and far. And those are in the Air Force, where they say a significant number of very experienced and high-level pilots have not showed up for service, and in the intelligence units. Now, the regular sort of special units in the armed forces, or the ground forces, I should say, have not been affected. It is said because there are so many of them, but there's also, to a certain extent, a little bit more of a tilt towards the right wing amongst some of those sort of services, whereas the intelligence and the Air Force are more, let's say, tilted again. I'm generalizing, but there's more of a tilt to the left. So those are the units that are going to be more and more harmed. Now, the question is, how far have we come? Is the IDF facing a situation where they are not ready for a war should it come, a conflict, a war, even attacks? That is very much up for debate, but it is clear that the IDF senior brass are extremely concerned about the situation. They spoke publicly, semi-publicly, they spoke in the Knesset, and there's been, as a result of that, massive attacks from the right-wing members of the government. They basically said that the IDF shouldn't be involved, they shouldn't be making these public statements, they shouldn't be talking about this, but it's clear that they believe that they're not being listened to, and it got to a point on Sunday where Netanyahu shouted, this is what was reported, at the IDF chief of staff and the head of the Air Force, saying, "You're making it look like the army is running the country. You know, I can't have it like that. I can't let it be seen by this," and really apparently shouted it. Obviously, that was denied by Netanyahu's office, but many other people who were involved in the conversation claimed that it was extremely heated because the IDF wanted to give this message that, you know, at the moment, it hasn't impacted too much, but it probably will in the autumn, in the fall. That's the message that's going around. You can see sometimes by the people who are set up for the media, how close they are to the IDF, current old-timers without too many connections to the current IDF senior echelons. You can see who is saying what and what the messages are to see a little bit what the truth is. And it does seem where a couple of months ago, it was more threat than anything else. It does seem to be really being the upper echelons in a major way at the moment. And there is a concern that Israel will not have the full capacity to be able to fight on, you know, a major front at this point. The last major issue, which is doing the rounds at the moment, is the issue of religious coercion. Now, it should be said, for those who don't know Israeli that well, that there's a time in the summer where the yeshivot, the ultra-Orthodox yeshivot, are out for a break. It's called Ben Azmanim, where they get a month between Tisha B'Av and the first of Elul, the month of Elul, which is Rosh Chodesh tonight. So this is when the ultra-Orthodox yeshivot go back. But during those few weeks, they're running the country. Any tourist spot, any sort of nature walk or any amusement park will be just absolutely full of ultra-Orthodox. And what has been seen the last couple of weeks, it's not to say we haven't seen it previously, maybe there's more of a noise this year because of everything else that's happening, but we've seen a lot more cases of women who have not been able to get on buses, or women have been sent to the back of buses, or women have been told, or men have been told that these are ultra-Orthodox only. Seems to happen quite a lot in Ashdod, where there's been a major influx of ultra-Orthodox specifically there. There was also a story on the news about United Airlines, where a journalist was asked to move seats. It's unclear exactly what happened. She claims it's because she was a woman, whereas the Haredi man involved said it had nothing to do with that. I sit next to women all the time. I just wanted my son and their friend to sit together, so I calmly asked her. So there's a bit of a debate around that, but it shows that there's a major sensitivity at this time, partly because another major issue, which is the Haredi conscription, IDF conscription bill. Now, 6 years ago, the High Court, the Supreme Court, asked the government to deal with this issue because the idea that it just sort of is left where a certain sector of the population just simply doesn't show up for service and is not being asked to show up for service is considered equal. And for 6 years, they kept on asking for more and more delay to deal with this issue. And it's clear that with a strong ultra-Orthodox rotation in a pretty conservative government, that they want by the Orthodox community say that this is really something that we want to deal with. And that is major sort of propulsions from the ultra-Orthodox community, why they support and one of, in some ways, are some of the biggest supporters of judicial reform, because they believe that if they manage to pass an override law or whatever it is, then they will be able to pass laws which have been struck down in the past by the Supreme Court as unequitable, unreasonable, perhaps, or any other reasons. So this is coming up. There's a debate now within the coalition. Should we move ahead with the reform? Should we put it off for 6 months? Should we put it off for a year? That's a discussion between Netanyahu and Justice Minister Levin. But the ultra-Orthodox have threatened not to support any more bills until the IDF conscription law, their IDF conscription law, which means that they will finally put into law what has always been sort of practiced, where the ultra-Orthodox do not serve in the army. And that is considered a red line for many in Israel, that you're actually putting into law an unequal and uneven demand from the country's citizens, where some people will have to serve their country and serve in the army, others will simply not. So that is a major issue coming up. Two more issues before we go to some questions. Hezbollah, the friction in the north is heating up. A lot of people talked about maybe there'll be some sort of conflagration in the north during the summer. As we've seen previously, conflicts tend to happen in the summer in Israel with either Gaza or Lebanon. And we saw the Director General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, give a very bellicose speech, as he always does, on the anniversary of the Second Lebanon War, which they claim that they won. And basically, interestingly, he did relate to the issue of whether the IDF is ready. He said that the IDF is in a worse state than it's ever been. And interestingly enough, he also talked about the ultra-Orthodox conscription law. He said if that passes, then Israel is over, the IDF is in real trouble. Interestingly, taking a position against Netanyahu on that, showing once again that Nasrallah in particular really does follow what's going on in Israel. So we'll see what happens, but definitely Hezbollah seem to be poking the eye of Israel, this government, Netanyahu, and will continue to do so, partly for internal reasons, but also perhaps they want to get into some sort of fight. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant spoke earlier the week that if Hezbollah does try anything, he will send Lebanon back to the Stone Age. This is the kind of rhetoric we've heard in the past. And we heard Nasrallah say exactly the same thing about Israel. It won't just be us sent back to the Stone Age, he threatened. Finally, back to judicial reform. It doesn't leave the headlines even in the summer when it is not being dealt with in the Knesset. Interestingly enough, the Attorney General, who is herself the subject of a lot of attacks from this government, and some of the reform bills that have been suggested would clip her wings or take away part of her position. Some are called to fire her. She is basically, she has a few different positions. One of them is supposed to defend the government, the Supreme Court on certain issues, but there is the right of the Attorney General, if they feel that they cannot defend the government on a certain issue, they can recluse themselves, and then the government can take a private attorney to represent them. And that's what's happened in the reasonableness hearings, which are upcoming in September. The Attorney General has said that she cannot defend the government and has given permission for the government, for Justice Minister Levin specifically, to bring in a private attorney. So this is interesting because it already shows at least part of the legal system is already basically saying that there could be a major problem with it. And one has to remember on this point that it was passed as a basic law, and the Supreme Court gave basic laws quasi-constitutional power, which means, and they have never, ever struck down a basic law. So this would be unprecedented, but certainly the signs are not good for the government. It's going to be a full bench, but it is going to be without the Attorney General defending the government on this. So we'll have to wait till September to see how this plays out. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. So going back to basics here, Don Sable asks, what exactly was the original Knesset override of the Supreme Court legislation that was being discussed? What became of it? How has it changed? And you did mention this already, but is the issue something the coalition has publicly put on hold for now?
Yeah, I mean, the override was probably considered the most extreme part of the judicial reform, which basically gave the government the ability, or the Knesset, the ability to override a situation where the Supreme Court has struck down a particular law. It's basically given itself the right to then ignore that. Um, and obviously that would be controversial because it basically completely nullifies the Supreme Court. Again, depending how strong it was, if it was on all issues or certain issues, and importantly, what majority you need. The original override bill basically had a majority, 61. There are those who say, if you could make it up to 80, which means you always have to bring in at least some of the opposition, then that would be fairer. But it does seem that that's off the table for the moment. Netanyahu, when he talks about all the different stages, at the moment, now that the reasonableness law has passed, the only one that he said is still really on the table is to change the makeup of the committee for the judicial selection committee to make it more weighted towards the democratically elected representatives, as opposed to the judicial system itself, which at this moment has a majority to basically assign itself like-minded people. That's the only one that he's really talking about. The override is very important for the ultra-Orthodox. We spoke about that a little bit earlier, because if the Supreme Court does strike down, for example, their idea of conscription law, they want the ability to basically override that decision. And that's why that particular law is very important for them. But at the moment, because it's the most extreme version, probably it's the one that rankles the most by opposition, because it basically would neuter the Supreme Court in a way that all the other parts wouldn't do to that same extent. So I doubt that there'll be an override clause, and it certainly won't be as extreme as the original tabled version, which basically gives this government an opportunity to do it anytime they want if it just has a 61 majority contained within the bill.
Thank you very much for that. So going back to your comments on the issues with the buses and the airplane, Hal Taras, do you think women's rights are being eroded in Israel? And if so, does this affect your attitude about the defense of Israel? And if so, how?
Well, no, officially, women's rights are not being eroded. Netanyahu came out again in one of these statements saying that absolutely he rejects this. He said that there is no place for that and there's no legal basis for that. So officially, it's absolutely forbidden to do so, but it's clear that there are certain lines, bus lines, I should say, which do this in practice. Are they allowed to? It's not clear. I watched something on the news just before, and if it's a private bus employed by the ultra-Orthodox community, and that is something which they themselves have decided, which is not for the general public, I don't know the law, but maybe that is more of a less of a problem legally than a public Egged bus. Egged is the national bus service that basically doesn't allow women on, or won't allow women on with what they consider immodest clothing, or will make women sit at the back. Again, it's a relatively minor phenomenon, but it's the kind of thing that makes a lot of headlines and a lot of noise. Obviously, legally, the status of women has not been eroded legally, but the ultra-Orthodox are certainly becoming more prominent in certain areas. They're asking for more separate beaches. There was a whole debate a week or so ago because the environment minister, one of the ministers in Israel, I think she's the environment minister, basically asked for certain springs. A lot of people in Israel like to visit springs in the summer, small sort of, or springs, sort of rivers or whatever. And there was talk of also having separate hours for men and women at some of these springs, which has never been there. And legal, again, the Attorney General had to get involved, and she said there's no legislation to support that. If you legislate, that's a whole other issue. But of course, she was attacked for the fact that she wouldn't allow it. So at the moment, there is not going to be that. And I doubt that there is the real stomach in this government to fight over something as relatively minor as that. But the issue does keep raising itself. At the moment, there's nothing official, there's no law being passed or anything like that, but there are certain areas, certainly where the ultra-Orthodox community are prominent, where they themselves will sort of insist on separation on the buses. And if someone not from that community wants to get on a bus, sometimes they've been harassed, but it's at the personal level, it's at the communal level, it's not at the national level. So women's rights are not being eroded, but certainly there seem to be, again, especially at this time of year where ultra-Orthodox are out and about a lot more, there's always these stories. Perhaps they're more prominent this year, perhaps there's more this year. It's hard to tell because obviously there's no statistics, but they seem to be getting more prominence in the media, certainly.
Thank you very much. Larry Greenberg asks, since the reform issue has flared up, has Aliyah been affected?
From what I have been reading, not necessarily. They've gone down, Aliyah numbers have gone down a little bit to pre-COVID levels. During COVID, they went up, perhaps because it was thought that Israel was doing very well with COVID and things like that. So Aliyah numbers did go up during COVID. Now I think they've pretty much gone down to pre-COVID levels. So it hasn't really been affected too much by the judicial reform, as far as I can tell. And also as far as tourism, incoming tourism, again, I haven't seen statistics. Obviously the government want to play up if there is. But as far as I can see, being around the country over the last week, there's a lot of tourists in the country. So I don't know if there are people who are not coming to Israel because of the judicial reform. As far as I know, the numbers haven't been largely affected by judicial reform, but perhaps we'll have to see next year because, people don't decide to make Aliyah from one day to the next. Usually they make it half a year in advance. So perhaps we'll see in the coming years whether there is an effect by the judicial reform.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. Stephen asks, although the reasonableness legislation was passed as a basic law, what occurs if the Supreme Court rejects it, as it seems the AG has suggested they should?
Well, he hasn't said that they should. She just said that she cannot defend it. She hasn't said that it shouldn't pass. She just has said that she will not defend it. Basically, the answer is it'll be a constitutional crisis, and people are talking about this. At the moment, for example, the National Security Minister is at odds with the police commissioner because the police commissioner said that he will obey the law. If the Supreme Court strikes it down, then simply it won't exist anymore. Whereas the National Security Minister, part of this present government, said, well, you should support the government's position on this. It'll be unprecedented to have such a situation. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. Netanyahu keeps his answer to that is we are a nation of laws, they have to be upheld. But you could argue both sides, again, depending where you come down. If you're a proponent of judicial reform, you say, well, the government passed a law, and it's a basic law, which has never been touched. So that's the will of the majority representatives, democratically elected representatives in the Knesset, whereas the opponents would say, yes, but it's a law which is undemocratic. And if the Supreme Court, which has the right to strike down laws, then the government should accept that. So it will be unprecedented. It will be very problematic if it is struck down, unless, of course, immediately it is struck down, the government accept that decision, which at the moment, certainly there'll be certain members of the government who will have a problem with that, but the tone will be set by the Prime Minister. So I guess hopefully Prime Minister Netanyahu will have a position either way and will lead with that, and whatever he says, hopefully, the government will fall in line, and hopefully there will be no constitutional crisis, but there is great potential for that at the end of this hearing. But again, that's next month, so we'll have to see what happens with that.
Thank you. In our last minute here, Doris Rose-Strauss asks, could you please comment on the light rail running on Shabbat?
Well, at the moment, it's not running on Shabbat. That's the decision was made by this government. It just opened today officially. There was a whole big opening ceremony. Obviously, Israel being Israel, there was problems even at the opening. But it is a major achievement, the light railway in the whole Tel Aviv region. It's not just in the city of Tel Aviv, it's Rishon LeZion, it's Bat Yam, it's all, many of the areas around. So it is a big achievement, but it is being clouded by the fact that it's not going to run on Shabbat. And as a result, the mayor of Tel Aviv boycotted the event. Don't forget there's municipal elections in a few months. So it certainly plays into his base, which is largely secular and left-wing, to not turn up to this event and to take a stand on it. But again, it also goes into the whole sort of debate. Religious coercion, should Israel as a Jewish state have laws like this? At the moment, public transport in most places, there isn't public transport in most places. There are in some, like Haifa, on Shabbat. But at the moment, the decision is not to have the light railway, largely because we have a more conservative, more religious government. Obviously, if we had the previous government and it opened, then they almost certainly would have allowed it to be on Shabbat. And maybe in the future it will be again. But at the moment, it's not on Shabbat. So we'll have to wait and see on that. But that's what they're basically starting with, it being a 6-day service.
All right. Thank you so much. So we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you for taking time to update us this week.
Thank you.
For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Greg Roman on defining U.S. policy towards the Azerbaijan-Armenian conflict. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.